The year was 1864, and the American Civil War had become a meat grinder. For 3 years, the Northern public had watched a succession of Union generals, men of high pedigree and polished boots, stumble, hesitate, and retreat the moment they caught sight of the gray-clad ranks of the Army of Northern Virginia. To the Southern soldier, Robert E. Lee was more than a commander. He was a god. To the Northern soldier, he was a ghost that haunted the woods of Virginia. But in the spring of that year, a new man arrived from the Western theater. He was rumpled, he smelled of cheap cigars, and he had a habit of chewing on a toothpick while men died by the thousands. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. History often paints Lee as the tactical genius and Grant as the butcher who simply had more men. But if you look at the private letters, the frantic dispatches, and the sudden shift in the Confederate high command, a different story emerges. The South wasn't afraid of the Union's numbers. They had been fighting against superior numbers since the first shot at Sumter. What they feared was the mind of the man who finally realized that this wasn't a game of chess, it was an execution. Before Grant, the war in the East was a choreographed dance. Union generals like McClellan or Hooker would plan a grand campaign, march into Virginia, get bloodied by Lee's superior maneuvering, and then retreat to Washington to reorganize. Lee had mastered the art of the psychological win. He knew that if he could just inflict enough pain, the Northern political will would crumble. He played on the hesitation of his opponents. He knew they were thinking about their reputations, their next promotion, and their place in the history books. Then came the wilderness. In May 1864, Grant and Lee met face to face for the first time in a dense, suffocating forest. The fighting was horrific. The underbrush caught fire, burning wounded men alive in the dark. By the standards of any previous year, the Battle of the Wilderness was a Union defeat. Grant had lost more men, his flank had been turned, and his army was exhausted. In the past, this was the moment the Union general would have ordered a retreat. The men in the ranks expected it. They began marching back toward the crossroads, assuming they were headed north to safety. But at the junction, Grant was sitting on his horse. He didn't point north, he pointed south. When the Union soldiers realized they weren't retreating, that for the first time in the war they were going to keep hitting Lee despite the losses, they began to cheer. And in that moment, the Confederate scouts watching from the tree line realized the war had changed. The dance was over. Grant brought a terrifying clarity to the conflict. He looked at the map and saw something his predecessors refused to acknowledge. The South could not replace its men. Lee's brilliance relied on the turning movement, heading the enemy where they didn't expect it, forcing a retreat and winning a gentlemanly victory. Grant decided he would no longer be turned. He decided that he would stay fastened to Lee's throat like a bulldog, regardless of the cost. In Richmond, the panic began to set in. Lee himself started to show signs of a man who realized he was finally trapped. He famously told his officers, "We must destroy this army of Grant's before he gets to the James River. If he gets there, it will become a siege, and then it will be a mere question of time." Lee knew his own legend was useless against a man who didn't care about legends. Grant didn't view Lee as a great captain of history. He viewed him as a rebel general who was currently in the way of the objective. There is a famous story from the Overland Campaign where a Union officer rushed up to Grant panicking about what Lee might do and how Lee was going to cut them off. Grant finally snapped. He told the officer, "I am heartily tired of hearing about what Lee is going to do. Some of you always seem to think he's suddenly going to turn a double somersault and land in our rear and on both of our flanks at the same time. Go back to your command and try to think what we are going to do ourselves instead of what Lee is going to do." This was the fear that permeated the Confederate ranks. It wasn't the fear of a better strategist, it was the fear of an inevitable force. Grant's strategy was simple and brutal, simultaneous movement. In the past, the Union armies fought separate wars. While Lee fought in Virginia, the Western armies fought in Tennessee. This allowed the South to use their railroads to move troops back and forth to wherever the danger was greatest. Grant put an end to that. He ordered every Union army to move at once. He told Sherman to get into the interior of the enemy's country as far as you can, inflicting all the damage you can. He told Meade to follow Lee wherever he goes. For Lee, this was a nightmare. He was used to being the one who dictated the tempo of the war. Now he was being hunted. He was being squeezed. Every time he tried to maneuver, Grant was there, sliding to the left, getting closer to the supply lines, forcing Lee into another bloody engagement. By the time they reached Cold Harbor, the carnage was so great that Union soldiers were pinning their names and addresses to the backs of their coats so their bodies could be identified. The North called Grant a butcher. The newspapers screamed for his removal. But Lincoln knew better. He said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." And Lee knew better too. He saw his veterans, the invincible infantry that had won at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, withering away. He saw his supplies drying up. Most importantly, he saw that Grant was not going to let go. When the armies finally settled into the trenches at Petersburg, the war of movement was dead. This was exactly what Lee had dreaded. He was locked in a cage with a man who had more food, more guns, and more will. Grant didn't just fight Lee's army, he dismantled the South's ability to exist. He sent Sherman to burn the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, so thoroughly that a crow flying over it would have to carry its own rations. This was the realization that broke the Southern spirit. They weren't just being outfought, they were being erased. Lee, the man who had outwitted every Union general before him, found himself reduced to a spectator in his own defeat. He watched as his men deserted by the thousands, not out of cowardice, but because they received letters from home saying their families were starving. Grant's fear factor wasn't based on a flashy trick or a brilliant gambit. It was based on the terrifying realization that he was the first Union general who truly accepted the nature of the war they were in. He didn't want to capture Richmond for the sake of a trophy. He wanted to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia so completely that the idea of a Confederacy would die with it. When the end finally came in April 1865, the two men met in a small parlor in a house owned by Wilmer McLean. Lee arrived in his finest dress uniform, wearing a sash of red silk and a jewel-encrusted sword. He looked like the personification of the Old South, dignified, aristocratic, and tragic. Grant arrived covered in mud. He wore a private's blouse with his general's star stitched on. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of a ditch. They talked for a while about the old days in the Mexican War. Grant, perhaps out of respect or perhaps out of his own quiet nature, almost forgot to write down the surrender terms because the conversation was so pleasant. But the terms themselves were the final act of the bulldog. Grant didn't demand Lee's sword. He didn't demand a parade of humiliation. He told the Southern soldiers to take their horses and go home for the spring planting. He fed Lee's starving army from his own rations. In that final act, Grant did something even more effective than defeating Lee on a battlefield. He took away Lee's ability to be a martyr. By being magnanimous, he made it impossible for the war to continue as a guerrilla conflict. Robert E. Lee had spent 4 years fearing Grant's relentlessness. On that day in Appomattox, he finally encountered Grant's humanity. The history books often focus on the grand maneuvers and the high casualty counts, but the war was won in the mind of one man who refused to be intimidated by a legend. Grant wasn't the most elegant general, and he certainly wasn't the most beloved, but he was the only man who looked at the invincible Robert E. Lee and didn't see a god. He saw a man who could be beaten, and because he believed it, he made the rest of the world believe it too. The Confederacy didn't fall because it ran out of courage. It fell because it finally met a man who didn't care about their courage. They met a man who simply would not stop. And in the end,
That is the most terrifying thing any enemy can face.